Flaxborough, in late June, had the peculiar air of a town perpetually balancing between pride and self-consciousness. The sun, as it often did in England, was intermittently shy, peering through clouds that seemed themselves undecided. At the Cornfield Hall, the local horticultural society was hosting its annual flower show, and the scent of dahlias mingled with the faint lingering aroma of tea and jam sandwiches. Mrs. Hargreaves, who judged herself the social arbiter of the hall, wandered among the exhibits, her gloved fingers poised as though to examine petals for signs of moral failing rather than mildew. Beside her, Mr. Codling, a retired accountant with a perpetual air of mild annoyance, muttered about the unacceptable audacity of some entrance floral arrangements. In Flaxborough, the arrangement of a rose was as much a statement of civic virtue as any council vote. At precisely 11 o'clock, a small, unexpected commotion arose in room 15, the otherwise unremarkable corner where amateur photographers displayed their prints. A loud clatter echoed as a tripod collapsed, sending a modest camera skidding across the polished floor. There was nothing overtly sinister about a falling tripod. Yet, for reasons no one could immediately articulate, an uneasy hush descended. "Good heavens! Is everyone quite all right?" asked Miss Fairweather, the secretary of the society, whose voice carried the tone of someone simultaneously alarmed and relieved to be in charge. She surveyed the crowd with delicate concern, ensuring no fainting or faint-hearted embarrassment had occurred. It was Mr. Jennings, the schoolmaster and perpetual volunteer, who first noticed something more troubling. The photograph itself, a serene landscape of a summer meadow, had been smudged across the centre. "But this wasn't accidental," he said, his usually mild voice cracking slightly with indignation. Someone has pressed their hand across it, deliberately." A ripple of murmurs followed. The words sabotage and shame fluttered through the hall like errant butterflies. People glanced at each other, suspicion mounting in the very mildest of ways. An eyebrow lifted, a small gasp caught mid-bite of sponge cake. Inspector Purbright, who had arrived simply to observe and enjoy the ritual of civic pride, noted all of this with quiet interest. He was of medium height, neat, and possessed a kindly expression that often caused people to underestimate the subtle keenness of his eyes. Purbright lingered by the refreshments table, watching the interactions unfold. He neither intervened nor hastened the gossip. He allowed it to flourish, as one might allow a garden to grow slightly wild, for the pattern of disorder often revealed more than the initial incident itself. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hargreaves leaned over Miss Fairweather's shoulder. "It's outrageous! Whoever did this has no sense of decency or taste," she whispered, as though scandal might infect the wallpaper if spoken too loudly. "I dare say," murmured Miss Fairweather, "it might have been an accident. The tripod did collapse after all." Her voice betrayed the slightest tremor of doubt, a crack in the otherwise impeccable veneer of civility. Purbright noted the hesitation, as one might note the tilt of a flower in the sunlight. It was slight, almost imperceptible, yet the mind naturally registers these anomalies. Someone, he thought, knew more than they were admitting, or perhaps feared what others might infer. By mid-morning, room 15 had become a focal point for whispers and conjecture. Yet outside, the town continued in cheerful oblivion. The baker delivered his bread, the children chased one another across the green, and the church clock struck 11 without fanfare, as if entirely uninterested in human trivialities. The incident at the flower show, minor though it seemed, planted a seed of unease. In Flaxborough, such seeds had a way of growing quietly, shaping conversation and suspicion long before anyone admitted to noticing them. And somewhere among the polite crowd, someone was watching, wondering just how much they could get away with. Purbright sipped his tea, his notebook unopened but ready. He was patient. He did not yet ask questions. He merely observed, for the subtle pulse of human discomfort was often far more revealing than loud accusations. And in the corner of room 15, behind the smudged photograph, a small folded piece of paper had fallen unnoticed. Its presence was almost comical in its insignificance, yet Purbright's gaze lingered, as if he already knew that trifles were the beginning of truths. The following morning, Flaxborough stirred into its accustomed rhythms, though the previous day's incident at the flower show lingered like a faint, awkward perfume in the air. at the corner cafe where the light from the window caught just so on the brass of the coffee machine, the usual morning crowd gathered. Mr. Codling, already frowning at his third cup of tea, was recounting the collapse of the tripod to Mrs. Longworth, who ran a small haberdashery on Eastgate Street. "It's quite preposterous," he insisted, tapping the table with a stubby finger, "that anyone could be so careless or so spiteful. One cannot simply smudge another's work and expect no consequences." Mrs. Longworth, knitting slowly, peered over her glasses. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Codling. Surely it's just the misfortune of an unstable tripod. The photographer is a touch nervous, you know, and you know how people exaggerate when their pride is wounded." Yet even as she spoke, the subtle edge of curiosity could not be entirely masked. Across the table, a young clerk, nervous and apologetic, leaned forward to add his conjecture. "I heard from Miss Fairweather that someone might have, deliberately placed a finger across the print. She said it herself. Perhaps there's a rivalry. Something in the school, maybe." At that moment, Purbright entered quietly, nodding to familiar faces, offering a courteous "good morning" here and there. He settled at a small table in the corner, positioning himself so that he could observe the exchange without drawing attention. While the town's gossips eagerly dissected the matter, he noted the inconsistencies in tone, the slight exaggerations, the grudging admissions that betrayed both embarrassment and the careful protection of one's own reputation. Across town the news travelled swiftly, though in Flaxborough it tended to take the form of interpretation rather than fact. In the post office, the postmistress leaned over the counter to whisper to a customer. "They say the photograph—" "Yes, the one in room 15. It wasn't an accident. Imagine someone daring to deface another's work." The customer, a retired nurse, clucked sympathetically, nodding as though she understood perfectly, though she had not seen the photograph herself. Meanwhile, in the more formal confines of the council chambers, the event became fodder for small jabs at municipal propriety. Councillor Durrant, a man of stern countenance and remarkably neat cufflinks, remarked that it was a small but troubling symptom of disorder among otherwise respectable citizens, prompting murmurs of agreement and a barely concealed eye-roll from his colleague, Mrs. Pemberton. The council had little power over floral misadventures, yet the opportunity to display moral rectitude was too tempting to ignore. Back at the Cornfield Hall, Purbright took the opportunity to examine room 15 with unobtrusive precision. The smudge photograph, though hardly dramatic, caught his attention. The pattern of the smear suggested something more deliberate than an accidental touch, yet the lack of any further damage indicated a careful, almost timid hand. Beneath the frame, half concealed by a cluster of other photographs, lay the small folded piece of paper Purbright had noticed the previous day. It was unassuming, innocuous even, but he noted its precise placement, deliberate in its negligence, as if it had been left for someone attentive to discover. He slipped it into his notebook without comment and returned to the centre of the room, listening to the faint buzz of polite chatter. Among the visitors, a young woman in a floral dress was speaking animatedly about her late entry to the show, while an older gentleman, his waistcoat buttoned far too tightly, muttered under his breath about the decline of proper standards. Everyone had an opinion, everyone had a version of the incident, and each version carried a shade of self-interest, an unspoken implication that some grievance had been satisfied or wrong endured. By late morning the story had grown in the telling. In the bakery on Church Street, the baker relayed to a customer that the photographer, a Mr. Holt, had looked quite affronted, as if the world itself had committed an injustice. The customer nodded gravely, as though the moral weight of a smudged print required the deepest consideration. Elsewhere, children who had been at the show delighted in exaggerating the fall of the tripod, claiming it had been a terrible crash like thunder, eliciting laughter from their parents while simultaneously embedding a small kernel of alarm in the town's collective imagination. Purbright, observing these proliferations of opinion, reflected on the familiar mechanics of Flaxborough's social machinery. A trivial event could, in the right conditions, propagate into a network of embarrassment, suspicion, and latent envy. His notebook, though still unopened, filled imperceptibly with small details, a hesitation here, a smile that seemed forced, the careful avoidance of certain gazes. These were not clues in the conventional sense, but they were no less significant than fingerprints or footprints. As the day progressed, A few individuals, primarily those with official roles in the Horticultural Society, began to speculate openly about motive. Some whispered of long-standing rivalry between amateur photographers, others hinted at personal grievances that might explain the deliberate smudge. Purbright noted that each theory contained a kernel of truth, though none was complete. It was in these gaps between statement and implication that the actual story would slowly emerge. By afternoon, the flower show had largely resumed its ordinary rhythm. Visitors wandered from room to room, children examined prize-winning vegetables, and Mrs. Hargreaves continued to hover near the judging table, expressing measured indignation whenever the conversation strayed too far from floral decorum. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, the event had left a subtle fissure, a quiet awareness that, in Flaxborough, even minor slights could carry consequences far beyond their immediate appearance. Purbright took note of the townspeople as they departed, filing away faces, voices, and postures in a manner that suggested an almost imperceptible map of social terrain. He was particularly attentive to Mr. Jennings, the schoolmaster, whose mild indignation seemed to mask more than mere disappointment at a smudged photograph. Likewise, the young woman in the floral dress displayed a practised nonchalance that bordered on performance, as though she wished to appear unconcerned while subtly gauging the reaction of others. By evening, as the hall emptied and the sun slanted low across the cornfield grounds, Purbright returned to the piece of paper he had tucked into his notebook. Unfolded, it contained only a few words, an apparently innocuous observation about the arrangement of photographs in the room, but the handwriting was precise, almost fastidious, hinting at a mind meticulous enough to craft both words and perhaps actions with equal deliberation. In the quiet of his office that night, Purbright considered the small disturbances of the day, the clatter of a tripod, the smudge on a print, the ripple of gossip that travelled faster than fact. Each element, he knew, was part of a subtle choreography. Flaxborough, serene and ordinary on the surface, had its undercurrents, and he would follow them patiently. For now, the town was merely unsettled, unaware that a minor disruption had begun to reveal the hidden alignments of envy, pride, and discreet rivalry that defined its social life. And as he prepared to leave his office, Purbright allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Trifles, he thought, often spoke the loudest. The morning after the flower show found Flaxborough quieter than usual, though only to those who looked for subtleties. The town streets were busy with the expected rhythms, the postman rattling along the cobbles, the bakery sending out the warm scent of fresh bread, and the church bells chiming insistently, as though to remind everyone that time had not paused for trifles. Yet beneath the surface, conversations from the previous day lingered, stretching thinly across market stalls, shop counters, and office corridors. Purbright, as was his custom, made his rounds with measured calm. He visited the cornfield hall once again, this time under the guise of checking on the collection of photographs and speaking politely with the stewards about catalogue arrangements. No one took notice of the subtle examination of expressions he conducted, the slight twitch of a lip, the nervous adjustment of a cuff, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact. These, he reflected, often told more than the most meticulously crafted testimony. Mr. Jennings, the schoolmaster, was the first to approach him, carrying a copy of the local newspaper. "Inspector," he said, voice trembling with a mixture of indignation and excitement, "there's been talk that this incident might be more than a mere accident. People are speculating, of course, but some suggest— well, I confess I find it difficult to believe, but they say it was intentional." Purbright inclined his head, a gesture of polite encouragement rather than agreement. "Speculation is natural," he said evenly. "It is often the first lens through which we perceive events." He let the words hang, giving Jennings ample space to fill with his own anxieties. By mid-morning, the ripple of discussion had reached the newspaper office. The editor, Mr. Tilling, who prided himself on the accuracy of his reporting, nonetheless allowed a brief paragraph of conjecture into the column, noting that while no harm had truly been done, the moral order of the flower show had been disrupted in a way that could not entirely be dismissed. It was the kind of wording that incited conversation without committing to accusation, the perfect blend of propriety and provocation that Flaxborough's citizens cherished. Purbright, reading the paper with mild interest, noted particularly the careful choice of phrases: disruption, moral order, and could not entirely be dismissed. Such language, he reflected, was deliberately calibrated to stir concern while maintaining civility. The subtle shaping of opinion was itself a clue to human behaviour, revealing what the town considered significant and what it wished to conceal. Later that afternoon, he visited the photographer, Mr. Holt, who lived in a small, neatly kept house just beyond the northern fringe of the town. Holt, a reserved man with a meticulous attention to detail, welcomed Purbright with professional courtesy, offering tea and small biscuits. He spoke of his work with a quiet pride, yet there was a tension beneath the surface, a careful avoidance of any admission of grievance. "Inspector," Holt said, pouring tea with precise movements, "the photograph, it was hardly a masterpiece, but it was important to me. The smudge, well, it was curious, wasn't it? I can think of several people who might resent my entries, though I should hope none would be so petty." His voice carried an edge of controlled indignation, and Purbright noted the subtle shift of his fingers as he set down the teacup, fingers brushing against the napkin in a gesture almost ritualistic. Purbright, as ever, asked no direct questions of accusation. He spoke gently of generalities, the importance of community events, the unpredictability of human interaction, the ways in which small grievances can manifest in minor disruptions. Holt responded freely, revealing more in his choice of words, his hesitations, and his carefully maintained composure than he might have realized. Meanwhile, outside the house, Flaxborough went about its daily commerce. Shopkeepers exchanged cautious greetings, neighbours commented on the mild weather, and children on their way home from school giggled over trivialities of yesterday's flower show, yet whispers of the incident found their way into unexpected ears. Mrs. Pemberton, while arranging ribbons in her shop, mentioned it to a visiting acquaintance, implying that such behaviour reflected a decline in proper decorum, though she was careful to avoid naming anyone directly. By late afternoon, Purbright returned to his office with a quiet sense of the town's temperament. He set the small piece of paper from room 15 on his desk and examined it under lamplight. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and the message, simple as it seemed, hinted at observation, surveillance, a careful accounting of the room's layout. A mind both meticulous and restrained, he thought, the sort who might act in ways meant to unsettle rather than harm, to mark territory rather than destroy. A knock at the door interrupted his reflection. It was Miss Fairweather, carrying a small parcel and an expression of mild worry. "Inspector," she began, in the polite, measured voice of someone who carefully weighs every word, "I wondered if you might have a moment. There's a matter that has come to my attention. Nothing urgent, I hope, but perhaps worth noting." She paused, glancing at the small paper on the desk, though she did not mention it. "Of course," Purbright replied, gesturing to a chair. "Please, do sit. Any detail, no matter how minor, may prove enlightening." She spoke of a slight discrepancy in the catalogue of entries. A photograph listed under one name appeared to have been taken by another, or so she believed, though the records were inconclusive. "I thought it was probably trivial," she said, her fingers fidgeting with the parcel. "But perhaps someone might notice. Perhaps it might matter." Purbright made no immediate comment, merely noting her tone, her careful phrasing, the way she avoided asserting certainty while implying a need for vigilance. These were the subtleties he relied upon, the unspoken tensions, the quiet implications that revealed far more than direct statements ever could. As the evening drew on, Flaxborough's shadows lengthened across the cobbled streets, and the town settled into its habitual calm. Yet beneath the ordinary facade, patterns of curiosity, resentment, and pride were forming. Purbright, reviewing his notes and the scattered impressions of the day, allowed himself to consider the intricate lattice of human behaviour he had observed. The incident at room 15, small and seemingly trivial, had begun to draw threads from multiple lives, weaving a web of subtle conflicts and concealed ambitions. And somewhere, in the polite civility of Flaxborough, the individual responsible, or at least aware of the consequences, was moving carefully, perhaps unaware that their actions had already begun to reveal more than intended. Purbright sipped his tea and reflected on the familiar lesson. In a town such as this, it was never the loud disruptions that mattered most, but the quiet ones that left a trail for those willing to observe. The next morning, Flaxborough awoke under a pale, tentative sun, and the ordinary bustle of town resumed with only the faintest tremor of unease beneath it. At the bakery on Church Street, The smell of freshly baked scones and the warmth of the oven carried reassurance to those who paused to listen. Mr. Codling, already perched on a high stool with his customary third cup of tea, leaned toward Mrs. Longworth and whispered with the gravity reserved for matters of civic importance, "I heard from a neighbour that the photographer, Mr. Holt, might be reconsidering his entries for next year. Can you imagine? One small smudge and he nearly withdraws." Mrs. Longworth nodded with an air of sympathy but allowed her eyes to flick toward the window, where children ran between puddles left by a brief overnight rain. "Yes, well," she said, "Flaxborough has a way of magnifying small events. Perhaps he simply needs reassurance. People are touchy about their work." Purbright, strolling through the square on his habitual early inspection, observed the exchanges with mild attention. He noted the curious pattern. The town's gossips were not only recounting the event itself, but embellishing it, assigning motives and temperaments as though each person's inner character could be inferred from the placement of a thumbprint. Such activity, he knew, would ultimately reveal more about the observers than the observed. By mid-morning, Purbright made his way to the school, intending to speak, unobtrusively, with Mr. Jennings. The schoolmaster was in his study, meticulously organising exercise books, but he welcomed Purbright with his usual, slightly nervous smile. "Inspector," he said, "I'm grateful you have called. I cannot help feeling there is a sort of underlying tension in town. Yesterday's event, trifling as it was, seems to have unsettled people more than they would admit." "Indeed," Purbright replied, folding his hands on the edge of the desk. "It is curious how minor disturbances can act as a lens, revealing small rivalries and subtle resentments." Jennings nodded eagerly, adjusting the spectacles perched precariously on the tip of his nose. "Precisely. Take, for instance, Miss Fairweather's comment about the catalogue. On the surface, trivial, but one wonders if there is more to it. A minor misattribution, yet it seems to excite a disproportionate amount of discussion." Purbright allowed a faint smile to show, though his mind was already cataloguing the minutiae. The hesitation in Jennings' voice, the insistence on propriety, the slight tension in the shoulders. He was beginning to perceive the social contours of the event, who felt entitled, who feared embarrassment, and who might be manoeuvring quietly behind the polite mask of civility. Later, walking along Eastgate Street, Purbright noted how rumours had begun to take shape, shifting slightly with each retelling. At the haberdashery, Mrs. Longworth mentioned the incident as evidence of the declining decorum in the town's public events. At the post office, the postmistress related it to her own private suspicions about certain families, while Mr. Tilling at the newspaper office hinted at possible rivalries among the amateur photographers. Purbright paused at the corner near the river, reflecting on these accounts. Each version was consistent enough to suggest authenticity, yet diverged in minor details, revealing the influence of personal bias and social position. It was in such divergences, he knew, that the truth often lay concealed. In the late morning, he received a brief note delivered by hand, a summons of sorts from Miss Fairweather, requesting his presence at the Cornfield Hall to inspect an issue with the catalogue. She greeted him with the same careful politeness as before, though a hint of anxiety flickered across her expression. "Inspector," she said, "it seems that one of the entries has been slightly misfiled. Perhaps an oversight, but I thought it prudent to bring it to your attention." Purbright examined the catalogue with deliberate attention, noting the discrepancy she indicated. The entry, a small landscape photograph, bore the name of one participant, yet the photograph itself had characteristics suggesting it belonged to another. The difference was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet enough to imply intention, or at least inattention. Purbright filed the observation away mentally, considering how such an apparently minor matter could intersect with yesterday's smudge. By afternoon, the day's quiet routine had begun to feel frayed. At the Cornfield Hall, a few townspeople returned to inspect their photographs once again. Mr. Jennings and a small group of local dignitaries discussed the possibility of revising judging criteria, while behind them, the camera tripod from room 15 stood unattended, a silent reminder of the prior disturbance. It had been repaired, yet its presence, as Purbright noted, was almost symbolic, a minor object embodying the disruption of order. Purbright, taking a seat unobtrusively, allowed himself to observe interactions. A young woman, who had arrived late the previous day, lingered near the display, fidgeting with the ribbons of her dress. She appeared interested in the reactions of others more than her own entry. Nearby, an older gentleman spoke to a colleague in low tones, nodding occasionally toward the photographs, as though assessing more than mere composition. Every glance, every subtle gesture was a thread in the slowly weaving tapestry of human motive. As evening approached and the sun slanted low over the rooftops, Purbright walked slowly through the town, reviewing the day in his mind. He noted the quiet machinations of social observation, people adjusting their behavior when others watched, rumors subtly redirected, grievances carefully concealed beneath civility. It was, he reflected, precisely this lattice of subtle interactions that formed the foundation of the unfolding puzzle. Returning to his office, Purbright opened the small notebook into which he had collected the fragment from room 15, his observations from the school, and the catalogue discrepancy. He did not yet attempt to connect them in overt theory. Instead, he studied them as one might study the surface of a still pond, noting ripples, reflections, and disturbances that might indicate hidden currents below. The town, unaware, continued its rhythms. Shops closed for the evening, children were called indoors, and the occasional light flickered in the windows of tidy houses. Yet beneath this apparent normality, subtle tensions had shifted. The smudge on the photograph, the misfiled catalogue entry, and the reactions of those around them had begun to illuminate hidden preferences, concealed anxieties, and understated rivalries. Purbright sipped his tea and made a small note. Minor disruptions, he reminded himself, often revealed the deepest human truths. And in Flaxborough, where civility reigned, supreme, it was in these quiet disturbances, these almost invisible disturbances, that the story of human behaviour unfolded in its most telling detail. The following morning brought a mild drizzle that left the cobbled streets of Flaxborough glistening, and a faint scent of damp earth in the air. The town, as always, maintained its orderly rhythm, but a subtle unease had begun to settle in those who had attended the flower show. At the corner cafe, where tea steamed in delicate porcelain cups, the regulars murmured in hushed tones. Mr. Codling, who had once again claimed his usual stool, leaned toward Mrs. Longworth with a conspiratorial air, lowering his voice, though there was no one near enough to overhear. "I've been thinking, Longworth," he whispered, "about the photograph in room 15. One cannot dismiss it so lightly. A deliberate smear. There must be motive, some small grievance festering unseen." Mrs. Longworth, arranging a basket of ribbons and lace, nodded slowly. "Yes, and in a town like ours, trifles have a way of magnifying. The smallest affront can ripple through conversation for weeks." She tapped her finger thoughtfully against the edge of the counter, a subtle gesture that suggested she was weighing possibilities far beyond mere floral etiquette. Purbright arrived just as a thin ray of sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the cafe. He took a seat in the corner, noting the expressions of those around him with gentle attention. His entrance caused a brief pause in conversation, just enough for small hesitations, subtle gestures, and the unguarded flickers of conscience to reveal themselves. These, he reflected, were more revealing than any overt statement of guilt or innocence. By mid-morning, the incident had evolved into a quiet debate about propriety. At the post office, the postmistress spoke in measured tones to an elderly customer about the photographer, Mr. Holt, and the perceived insult to his work. Meanwhile, Mr. Tilling at the newspaper office weighed whether another article might be appropriate, carefully balancing the need for news against the risk of inflaming petty resentments. In Flaxborough, information rarely travelled neutrally. It was always filtered through pride, embarrassment, or social aspiration. Purbright decided to revisit the Cornfield Hall to examine the photograph once again, this time with the aim of observing the town's interaction with it. The smudge, faint but deliberate, remained the focal point. Visitors inspected the print with polite curiosity, occasionally murmuring among themselves. Purbright noted the way individuals' opinions diverged subtly. Some dismissed it as accidental, others implied a hidden slight, and a few observed it with an almost analytical detachment. Each response, he realized, revealed more about the observer than the photograph itself. In a quiet corner of the hall, the young woman in the floral dress lingered once more, apparently absorbed in the display. Purbright, from his unobtrusive vantage, observed the nervous glances she cast toward the other attendees. There was a careful calculation in her manner, a deliberate modulation of posture and expression that suggested awareness of scrutiny. She was, as he suspected, both participant and observer, a duality that could, if mismanaged, reveal intentions unintended by ordinary social performance. By late morning, he made his way to the school to speak with Mr. Jennings again. The schoolmaster, still precise in his habits but increasingly anxious over the minor scandal, greeted him with measured enthusiasm. "Inspector," Jennings said, adjusting his spectacles, "I fear that what seemed a trivial incident has begun to unsettle certain members of the community. Parents speak in hushed tones, children repeat overheard remarks with exaggeration, and one cannot help but notice that everyone is quietly aligning themselves according to personal sympathies and grievances." Purbright inclined his head. "It is often the case," he remarked quietly, "that minor disturbances expose the underlying architecture of social networks. Trivialities, when magnified by human perception, can reveal motives far greater than the event itself." Jennings nodded, his hands trembling slightly over the ledger he had been sorting. "Yes, and it is remarkable how people can remain polite, even charming, while simultaneously manoeuvring to protect themselves or to observe others. One cannot dismiss civility as honesty." After leaving the school, Purbright strolled along Eastgate Street, reflecting on the patterns he had observed. The young clerk, who had commented on potential rivalry among photographers, lingered near shop windows, murmuring conjectures to anyone who would listen. Mrs. Longworth and a few other residents exchanged cautious glances, their words precise and their gestures calculated, suggesting that each was both observer and participant in an evolving social tableau. By afternoon, Purbright returned to his office to review the small piece of paper from room 15. Its precise handwriting and understated content had seemed inconsequential at first, but he now perceived a subtlety. The author's intention was not to communicate broadly, but to convey a private signal, visible only to a careful observer. This aligned neatly with his growing impression that the smudge was less about vengeance or anger, and more about a nuanced assertion of control or observation. As the day wore on, Purbright noted a growing pattern of interactions, people avoiding direct eye contact, casual remarks loaded with implication, gestures that betrayed concealed thoughts. The town's gossip had begun to crystallize, yet he could see the misalignments, the inconsistencies, the subtle hints that one participant, or more, was carefully testing boundaries while maintaining outward civility. Evening fell with the usual quietude of Flaxborough streets. Windows glowed softly, and the faint sounds of domestic activity filtered through closed doors. Purbright, seated at his desk, reviewed his observations. The smudge, the misfiled catalogue entry, the careful movements and guarded speech of the townspeople, all these elements hinted at a deeper pattern. He allowed himself a small private reflection. In Flaxborough, civility was the mask beneath which ambition, envy and discretion operated. Minor incidents, handled with attention, revealed more than sensational misdeeds ever could, and room 15, trivial as it seemed, had quietly exposed a network of observation, subtle rivalry, and careful manoeuvring that would take time to untangle fully. Purbright closed his notebook, satisfied for the moment that the day's careful watching had added yet another layer to the emerging tableau. Tomorrow he would continue to observe, to listen, and to consider human behaviour in its most understated, revealing forms. In Flaxborough, he reflected, it was never the loud disruptions that mattered, it was the quiet, calculated gestures that told the real story. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke to a thin mist that clung to the edges of the rooftops and lingered in the narrow alleys. The town moved through its familiar routines, but beneath the surface, the incident at room 15 continued to ripple quietly. The flower show had ended, yet in tea rooms, shops and council chambers, conversation returned inevitably to the smudged photograph, the misfiled catalogue entry, and the subtle anxieties that seemed to have spread through even the most decorous households. Purbright, as was his custom, walked along the high street, observing the ebb and flow of activity. Shopkeepers exchanged measured greetings, children ran with the carelessness of youth, and housewives carried parcels with a polite yet watchful eye. There was, he noted, an almost imperceptible tension in the mannerisms of several townspeople, a glance lingering too long, a hand smoothed over a lapel, a pause in conversation that seemed to weigh the consequences of words. These were the patterns he catalogued quietly, aware that the truth often revealed itself in such minutiae rather than through overt declarations. He arrived at Cornfield Hall mid-morning, ostensibly to review administrative matters with the stewards, yet his attention naturally gravitated toward room 15. The photograph with the faint smudge had been replaced behind glass, yet its presence still drew discreet observation. A small group of visitors examined it, speaking in hushed tones. One or two offered casual speculation, yet the tone was careful, as though anyone expressing certainty risked an implied accusation. Purbright observed the young woman in the floral dress lingering again near the display, her posture both attentive and self-conscious, as though balancing curiosity with the awareness of being observed herself. By late morning, he found himself speaking once more with Mr. Jennings, the schoolmaster. The man's anxiety, though restrained, had grown with the continuing attention of the town. "Inspector," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "I'm beginning to feel that what appeared trivial is, in fact, causing unease that extends beyond mere propriety. Parents murmur, colleagues speculate, and the children, well, they overhear and repeat, often embellishing without intent." He sighed, a faint quiver in his voice betraying the frustration he had so carefully concealed before. Purbright nodded, his tone calm and measured. Indeed, in Flaxborough, the smallest of disturbances can illuminate the underlying structure of social interactions. Observing reactions often tells us more than examining the event itself. He allowed a moment's pause, permitting Jennings to fill the space with further reflection. As the afternoon unfolded, Purbright made his way to the post office. The postmistress, discreetly attentive, mentioned to him a minor but curious development. A note had arrived from Mr. Holt, the photographer, though it bore no signature. It contained merely a few words of observation regarding the placement of his entries, phrased in a neutral, almost clinical manner. Purbright accepted this detail without comment, filing it away in his mental ledger. The intention was subtle, and yet, like the smudge on the photograph, it suggested a deliberate awareness of events. Someone was observing, recording, and subtly influencing perception. Walking along the riverbank later that day, Purbright reflected on the network of interactions he had observed. The young woman, the schoolmaster, the postmistress, the stewards at Cornfield Hall, all played their roles within a lattice of civility, curiosity, and concealed motives. Each action and hesitation added a thread to a growing tapestry that he was careful to examine in its entirety before drawing conclusions. By evening, a second, more curious incident emerged. While the Cornfield Hall staff were rearranging certain exhibits, a small frame fell from a shelf, narrowly missing the foot of an attendant. The photograph inside was intact, yet its sudden descent drew attention. There was, of course, no immediate evidence of malice. It seemed an accident caused by a slightly unstable shelf. And yet the timing, coming days after the initial smudge, following the arrival of the anonymous note, produced a ripple of unease. Attendees at the hall speculated quietly, perhaps a new hand, a deliberate act to unsettle, or merely the consequence of negligence. Purbright, observing from a distance, did not intervene. He noted, with gentle attention, the reactions of those present. Some immediately sought to reassure one another, offering calm words and rational explanations. Others lingered, exchanging whispered conjectures, eyes flicking toward the fallen frame with suspicion. In Flaxborough, he knew, the line between accident and design was a matter of perception as much as reality, and it was these perceptions that revealed character. Later that evening, back in his office, Purbright examined the various elements of the unfolding pattern: the smudge, the misfiled catalogue entry, the anonymous note, and the fallen frame. All were minor individually, yet collectively they suggested a deliberate shaping of events, a careful modulation of disruption. The person responsible, if there was one, acted with subtlety, intending observation and reaction rather than overt harm. He reflected on human nature, as he often did in such moments: the desire to assert control, the instinct to gauge perception, the intricate dance of civility and concealment. In a town like Flaxborough, where reputation and propriety were prized above all, The quiet acts of subtle influence carried far more significance than dramatic gestures ever could. Purbright sipped his tea and made notes, not of conclusions, but of impressions, hesitation, careful observation, understated anxiety, the strategic use of civility, each added layer of understanding, building toward a framework that would, in time, allow him to see the whole picture. And as the evening shadows deepened across the streets of Flaxborough, he allowed himself the satisfaction of knowing that patience, observation, and subtle deduction would reveal truths that the town itself might overlook. The morning air in Flaxborough carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the residual dampness of early summer drizzle, yet beneath the town's routine calm, an undercurrent of quiet speculation continued to hum. At the Cornfield Hall, the exhibits were once more arranged with meticulous care, though the memory of the smudged photograph, the misfiled catalogue entry, and the fallen frame lingered like a subtle echo, unspoken yet present in the mannerisms of those who entered the rooms. Purbright arrived shortly after 9, his coat neatly buttoned and his expression courteous but alert. He moved slowly through the hall, observing visitors as they inspected the photographs. Some spoke softly, exchanging polite commentary on composition or lighting, while others allowed small, telling gestures, an awkward glance, a momentary flush, a hand pressed lightly to the lips, to betray their interest in more than the art itself. The young woman in the floral dress was once again present, lingering near the same corner where the first incident had occurred, her posture careful, her eyes darting almost imperceptibly toward those observing her. By mid-morning, the social machinery of Flaxborough had begun to shift in response to the subtle tension. In the tea rooms, remarks about the flower show were now infused with conjecture about motives and personalities. Mr. Codling leaned over his cup to whisper that someone was clearly enjoying the attention their mischief had caused, while Mrs. Longworth nodded, weaving her own suspicions into the commentary. These conversations, seemingly trivial, were in fact the threads that tied together disparate observations, forming a lattice of human behaviour that Purbright studied with quiet precision. Purbright made his way to the school to speak briefly with Mr. Jennings, who had grown increasingly anxious. "Inspector," Jennings said, adjusting his spectacles with a nervous tremor, "I fear that the events of the flower show, minor as they seemed, have led to a subtle fracture among the participants. There is hesitation, unspoken resentment, and an almost palpable desire to assert propriety in the face of perceived impropriety." Purbright listened carefully, nodding. "It is often the case," he observed gently, "that civility serves as both shield and signal. People act with decorum, yet in doing so, they reveal much about their priorities, their anxieties, and the limits of their patience." He allowed the silence to settle, letting Jennings elaborate in his own careful, measured way. By early afternoon, a second incident shifted the focus of attention. While arranging an auxiliary display of botanical sketches, one of the attendants discovered that a delicate frame had been slightly repositioned, so subtly that it was not immediately apparent to casual observers. Yet the adjustment, though minor, drew a ripple of interest. Questions were whispered. Who had moved it? Was it intentional or accidental? And if intentional, why? Purbright, quietly noting reactions, observed how different individuals responded. Some quickly rationalized it as an accident, offering gentle reassurances. Others, however, leaned closer, exchanging guarded glances and low-toned commentary. It was precisely these reactions, the careful modulation of speech and gesture, that spoke to the underlying concerns of pride, reputation, and rivalry. The young woman, noticing the gathering attention, approached the display with an expression of deliberate neutrality, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation. Purbright, seated unobtrusively, recorded the nuance. She monitored others' reactions as much as she examined the display, indicating an awareness of both observation and consequence. He made a note of the pattern, linking it in his mind to the prior smudge, the anonymous note, and the fallen frame. Each was minor in isolation, but collectively they hinted at a subtle orchestration, someone manipulating perception with care rather than seeking overt disruption. By late afternoon, the town's subtle rivalries became more evident in ordinary places. In the post office, the postmistress spoke quietly to a visitor about minor inconsistencies in correspondence, hinting at a pattern of surveillance or careful attention. At the bakery, Mrs. Longworth remarked to a neighbour that small gestures reveal far more than grand announcements ever could. Even the children, repeating snippets of overheard commentary, inadvertently reinforced the town's quiet network of observation, their innocent exaggerations highlighting the interplay between perception and fact. Purbright, walking along the riverbank later, reflected on the town's behaviours as he had often done in moments of calm observation. He considered the interplay of civility and subtle rivalry, the ways in which minor incidents revealed both restraint and ambition. In Flaxborough, he knew, outward calm masked a lattice of personal interests, and only those willing to observe the quiet gestures and indirect signals could discern the true currents beneath the surface. Returning to Cornfield Hall in the evening, Purbright reviewed his notes once more. The smudge, the misfiled entry, the anonymous note, the slight movement of the frame, each suggested someone carefully measuring the reactions of others, testing the boundaries of decorum, and asserting influence without detection. The pattern was subtle and yet unmistakable to a patient observer. As dusk fell and the hall emptied, the townspeople returned to their homes, carrying with them impressions, half-formed suspicions and minor anxieties. Purbright, seated in his office with tea steaming beside him, considered the emerging network of behaviour. He reflected that in a town like Flaxborough, it was not the obvious acts that mattered, but the small, deliberate gestures, the quiet tests of social propriety, and the careful orchestration of perception. Tomorrow, he knew, would offer further opportunity for observation. The individual, or individuals, behind the subtle manipulations were likely to act again, and only patience, attention, and careful interpretation would reveal their intentions. Purbright allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The threads were gathering, the tapestry of motive was taking shape, and Flaxborough, polite and serene on the surface, continued to reveal its hidden tensions in ways both delicate and telling. The morning in Flaxborough was unusually still, the mist lingering longer than usual over the cobbled streets and the river's surface, reflecting a muted, silvery light. Though outwardly the town appeared serene, a subtle tension had settled like a low hum beneath everyday activity. The flower show's minor incidents had now been absorbed into conversation, yet they continued to ripple quietly, shaping perceptions and interactions with an understated persistence that only someone observant like Purbright could fully appreciate. He arrived at Cornfield Hall shortly after 9, noting the gentle bustle of staff preparing for a small late-week gathering of horticultural enthusiasts. Visitors trickled in, murmuring polite greetings, exchanging measured remarks about the arrangements, and glancing casually, though with discreet interest, toward room 15. The photograph with the faint smudge remained on display, framed and protected, but its presence still invited subtle speculation. Purbright observed the reactions carefully. Some attendees ignored it entirely, others whispered softly, and a few examined it with a precision that suggested more than casual curiosity. By mid-morning he made a brief stop at the school to confer once again with Mr. Jennings. The schoolmaster, whose anxiety had been growing in tandem with the town's quiet ferment, spoke of small but telling observations. The way parents lingered near notice boards, exchanging furtive comments, the careful adjustment of clothing or gestures when entering the hall, and the subtle but unmistakable attempts by several townspeople to gauge reactions without revealing their own judgments. "Inspector," Jennings said, smoothing the edge of his notebook, "it is remarkable how even the most polite individuals allow their unease to show in these minor details. A glance, a shift in stance, a hesitation in speech, all betray concerns that civility would otherwise conceal." Purbright nodded, his eyes quietly following a group of parents entering the hall. "It is often the case," he replied gently, "that outward decorum is maintained precisely to disguise deeper inclinations, ambitions, or anxieties. Observing the subtleties is often more informative than listening to statements alone." By early afternoon, a fresh complication emerged. The young woman in the floral dress, whose presence had been increasingly notable in previous days, was observed speaking quietly with Mr. Holt, the photographer. Their conversation was polite and measured, yet Purbright's careful attention revealed nuances in posture and tone. Slight tilts of the head, the occasional lingering pause, and fleeting expressions that hinted at concealed amusement or perhaps subtle testing of boundaries. The observer in him noted these details meticulously, understanding that such gestures were often deliberate and carried more weight than overt action. Elsewhere, in the town's more ordinary settings, the ripple of subtle tensions persisted. At the post office, the postmistress relayed rumours to a neighbour about minor misalignments in correspondence, framed as casual observation, yet hinting at a latent sense of oversight or surveillance. At the bakery, Mrs. Longworth continued to comment on human behaviour, emphasising the revelation of character in small gestures rather than through overt deeds. Even the children, repeating overheard remarks, played an unintentional part in shaping the town's perception of events, their innocent exaggerations amplifying the quiet drama. By mid-afternoon, Purbright returned to Cornfield Hall to witness a minor but significant incident. One of the display cases, holding sketches of local flora, had been found slightly ajar, not enough to suggest theft or tampering, yet enough to attract attention from observant visitors. The adjustment was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet the reactions it elicited were telling. Some staff offered immediate reassurance, dismissing it as an accident. Others exchanged glances and murmured quiet speculation. Purbright catalogued each response, noting who displayed anxiety, who feigned indifference, and who observed the observers with discreet interest. The young woman lingered nearby once more, her attention seemingly divided between the display and the responses of those around her. She adjusted her posture and tilted her head in ways that suggested careful calculation, watching, listening, and subtly gauging the impact of minor disruptions on others' composure. Purbright, seated unobtrusively at a corner desk, made careful mental notes. The duality of participant and observer, the awareness of social perception, the quiet assertion of influence. Each movement, while trivial in isolation, formed part of a broader pattern that was beginning to take shape. As evening approached, the hall emptied slowly. Staff tidied exhibits, while visitors departed with a mixture of polite commentary and lingering curiosity. Purbright lingered in the quiet of the room, reviewing his notes. The smudge photograph, the misfiled catalogue entry, the anonymous note, the displaced frame, and now the subtle manipulation of the display case. Each incident was minor individually, yet collectively they hinted at a deliberate orchestration of perception, a careful probing of boundaries, and a subtle testing of reactions. Returning to his office, Purbright considered the town's behaviours in a broader context. In Flaxborough, civility masked ambition, and observation itself could be a form of influence. Small gestures, when combined and repeated, formed a lattice of social dynamics that revealed much about intention, hierarchy, and rivalry. The individual or individuals orchestrating these minor disruptions were not acting from malice, but from curiosity, subtle assertion, or perhaps a desire to measure the limits of social propriety. He poured himself a cup of tea and allowed a moment of reflection. Patience, attention, and careful interpretation would, as always, be the key to understanding. Flaxborough, outwardly calm and polite, was quietly revealing its deeper patterns of human behaviour. And Purbright, quietly observant, was noting every gesture, every hesitation, every subtle test that hinted at the truth lying just beneath the surface. The morning in Flaxborough was unusually bright, a rare clarity that cast sharp reflections on the polished cobbles and lent a crispness to the air. The town, outwardly unchanged, moved through its habitual rhythms. Deliveries were made, shopkeepers arranged their displays, and children ran past with the careless exuberance of those unaware of the subtleties shaping adult conversation. Yet beneath this ordinary appearance, the consequences of the flower show incident, minor as they seemed, continued to ripple through social interactions, now with a faint tension that suggested an imminent shift. Purbright, observing from his habitual vantage on the high street, noted the subtle changes in demeanour. Some townspeople walked a little straighter, others lingered in polite discussion longer than necessary, their words carefully weighted. Even in casual greetings, a minor hesitation betrayed awareness of events extending beyond their immediate perception. These nuances, imperceptible to most, were the threads from which Purbright began to trace a larger pattern. By mid-morning, he arrived at Cornfield Hall, ostensibly to check on routine arrangements, but with his attention inevitably drawn to room 15. The photograph with the faint smudge remained behind glass, and the displaced frame from the previous day had been corrected, yet the subtle tension surrounding both lingered. Visitors now spoke less of the exhibits themselves and more of one another's reactions. Whispers, careful glances, and barely perceptible nods betrayed an awareness of scrutiny, suggesting that the town had become as much a theatre of observation as a place of display. The young woman in the floral dress was present once more, lingering near the displays, yet not overtly inspecting them. Purbright noted her careful monitoring of other visitors, the measured tilts of her head, the precise modulation of facial expressions, the small gestures that suggested she was testing the reactions of those around her. She was, in effect, conducting an experiment in social perception, and Purbright catalogued every subtle signal, aware that this dual role of observer and participant often revealed more than overt statements ever could. By noon, a more tangible complication arose. One of the auxiliary displays, a modest series of sketches submitted by local schoolchildren, had been found slightly askew, the positioning of a few frames inconsistent with the intended arrangement. Though minor, the discrepancy was enough to provoke murmured commentary. Staff immediately offered polite reassurance, while others whispered, speculating whether the shift was accidental or intentional. Purbright observed carefully, noting which individuals sought to calm tensions and which lingered, exchanging furtive glances as if to measure the impact of the minor disorder. Walking through the hall's corridors, Purbright reflected on the unfolding pattern. The smudged photograph, the misfiled catalogue entry, the anonymous note, the slightly displaced frames, and now the subtle adjustment of children's sketches, all pointed to a deliberate exploration of reactions, a quiet test of social boundaries conducted under the guise of ordinary occurrences. The subtlety of these acts suggested a mind careful and precise, intent on measuring influence rather than creating disorder outright. By mid-afternoon, the town's response began to crystallize further. At the post office, the postmistress mentioned in subdued tones that she had noticed certain correspondences arriving with curious attention to detail, phrased neutrally yet implying observation. At the bakery, Mrs. Longworth engaged a neighbour in careful conversation, commenting on the revelation of character through minor gestures and the ways in which people revealed their inclinations under the smallest pressures. Even the children, unwitting participants, amplified the town's quiet network of perception, repeating overheard remarks and adding small, innocent embellishments. Later, Purbright returned to his office with careful notes on the day's observations. The young woman, the schoolmaster, the staff at Cornfield Hall, and others formed a lattice of interactions, each act, each hesitation, each subtle adjustment contributing to an emerging pattern. It was now evident that the incidents were not isolated. They were connected by intent, by observation, and by a careful orchestration of social dynamics. As evening fell, a quiet event confirmed the growing pattern. While the Cornfield Hall staff were conducting routine maintenance, a small envelope appeared, placed subtly atop one of the display cases. Inside was a brief note, a single, neutral statement observing the arrangement of certain entries, unsigned and precise in tone. Though unobtrusive, it carried with it a quiet authority, a signal that someone was measuring reactions, testing civility, and carefully guiding perception without overt interference. Purbright examined the note, noting the handwriting, the choice of words, and the subtlety of its placement. It was, he reflected, an extension of the pattern he had been tracing all week, deliberate, restrained, and meticulously calibrated to provoke reflection rather than alarm. The town emptied slowly, houses taking on the warm glow of lamplight, the gentle murmur of domestic life, the occasional laughter of children, and the soft clang of shutters closing for the night, created the familiar rhythm of Flaxborough. Purbright, seated in his office with a cup of tea, reviewed the accumulating evidence. The minor disruptions, the subtle observations, and the carefully managed reactions all suggested a single, deliberate mind, orchestrating events with remarkable precision. He allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. The framework of human behaviour was revealing itself, civility masking intention, observation guiding interaction and small acts, measured and subtle, exposing the inner workings of pride, curiosity, and discretion. Patience, he knew, was now essential. The next steps, the next reactions, and the next tests would emerge naturally, and only careful attention would reveal the individual responsible for this quiet orchestration of the town's social rhythms. Flaxborough, polite and serene on the surface, continued to demonstrate the intricate interplay of perception, propriety, and subtle influence. Flaxborough woke to a gentle, overcast morning, the kind that seemed to soften the edges of buildings and streets, and even the town's subtle tensions appeared muted beneath the grey sky. Yet, to Purbright, nothing about the day's calm was ordinary. The events of the past week, room 15, the smudged photograph, the misfiled catalogue entry, the anonymous note, the displaced frames, had woven themselves into the fabric of the town's consciousness, and he suspected that the next move, subtle as always, would emerge from the quiet observances of its citizens. He began his morning with a slow walk along the high street, noting the gentle bustle of shops opening, deliveries arriving, and children on their way to school. Conversations were measured, polite, and yet, as always, layered with subtext. A baker commented to a neighbour on the curious attention given to minor details at the hall, and a clerk at the post office murmured about the anonymous note. Each observation, though couched in civility, was another thread to be traced, another small window into character, motives, and social positioning. By mid-morning, Purbright made his way to Cornfield Hall. The young woman in the floral dress arrived shortly after him, her movements precise, her gaze discreetly measuring the reactions of those around her. As he walked through room 15, he observed how the small incidents had shifted attention. Visitors spoke less of the artwork itself and more of the behaviours they noticed in others. The hall had subtly transformed into a social observatory, each gesture and glance a potential clue. Shortly after, a minor but telling incident occurred. One of the display stands, holding photographs of local gardens, tilted slightly. It was not enough to damage the prints, yet enough to catch the attention of attentive visitors. Murmurs spread like a whisper through the room, polite inquiries followed, and the staff immediately adjusted the stand, smoothing the disruption. Purbright noted who offered reassurance, who exchanged cautious glances, and who lingered with a subtle sense of curiosity. These reactions, he realized, were as revealing as the incidents themselves. By early afternoon, Purbright observed a private exchange between the young woman and Mr. Jennings. They spoke quietly near a corner of the hall, their words inaudible to the rest, yet the nuances in posture, gestures, and timing were unmistakable. She leaned slightly closer, he nodded subtly, and they parted with a faint, almost imperceptible adjustment in expression, a dance of civility and calculation that spoke of observation, negotiation, and social manoeuvring. Purbright catalogued each movement with meticulous attention, understanding that these small interactions often contained far more information than overt actions. Elsewhere, in the town's quieter spaces, other threads continued to weave. At the bakery, Mrs. Longworth commented to a neighbour on the revealing nature of minor gestures, emphasizing how social propriety could disguise underlying intentions. At the post office, the postmistress mentioned the seemingly trivial but precise observations in correspondence that had begun to attract attention, hinting at subtle surveillance or testing. Even the children contributed, unknowingly amplifying the town's lattice of perception with repeated phrases and innocent exaggerations. By late afternoon, Purbright returned to his office, reviewing the accumulated observations. The pattern was becoming clear. The minor disruptions, subtle notes, and discreet manipulations were not random. They were deliberate, calculated to provoke observation and measure reactions without creating overt conflict. He considered human nature, as he often did, reflecting on how civility, curiosity, and pride intersected to reveal intentions in the smallest of gestures. As evening fell, Purbright arranged a small, deliberate test of his own. He requested a private viewing of the photographs and sketches in room 15 with Mr. Holt, the young woman, and Mr. Jennings present. The room, though familiar, felt charged with quiet expectation. Purbright allowed subtle comments to pass, observing the small, almost imperceptible shifts in posture, the careful modulation of voice, and the glances exchanged among the three. It was in these minor cues, the hesitation of a hand, the fleeting lift of an eyebrow, the almost invisible pause in speech, that Purbright discerned the threads he had been tracing for days. One person, and one alone, consistently reacted with the precise awareness, the careful observation, and the controlled modulation that marked intentional orchestration rather than accident. By the time the participants departed, Purbright sat quietly, reviewing the final notes of his test. The lattice of interactions, the minor disturbances, and the careful calculations of reactions all pointed toward the individual who had subtly shaped the week's events. The smudge, the misfiled entry, the anonymous note, the displaced frame, and the subtle adjustments of displays had been part of a carefully designed experiment, an assertion of influence conducted with civility and restraint, yet revealing far more than any overt act could have achieved. Purbright reflected on the nature of human behaviour in Flaxborough, the combination of pride, discretion, observation, and the quiet assertion of subtle influence. The town, polite and serene on the surface, had become a theatre of small revelations, each minor act illuminating character, motive, and social hierarchy. Patience, attention, and careful interpretation had uncovered a truth that was invisible to those who had not been looking for the subtleties beneath everyday civility. As darkness settled over the streets of Flaxborough, Purbright prepared for the final step. Tomorrow he would draw together the threads of observation, conversation, and subtle manipulation to reveal the truth quietly, politely, and without theatrical flourish. The town would understand, in due course, how minor gestures and deliberate observation had created a lattice of influence that exposed intention and revealed human nature in its most understated form. The morning of the final revelation was calm, with the soft light of early sun diffused through a thin veil of clouds, casting a gentle glow across the streets of Flaxborough. The town appeared unchanged, orderly as always, yet beneath this ordinary exterior a quiet anticipation lingered, a sense that subtle threads were about to converge, and the invisible lattice of observation, small provocations, and understated manipulation was approaching its moment of clarity. Purbright arrived at Cornfield Hall mid-morning, his pace unhurried, his eyes attentive to the rhythms of the day. Visitors were few, and those present moved with polite civility, exchanging gentle commentary about the exhibits, their eyes flicking occasionally toward room 15. The photograph with the smudge, the misfiled catalogue entry, the displaced frames, and the anonymous note, all were in place, preserved yet charged with subtle meaning, awaiting the final act of observation and revelation. The young woman in the floral dress arrived shortly after him. Her movements were precise, her posture measured, and her eyes held that quiet alertness he had seen throughout the week. She lingered near the corner display, adjusting her position in small increments, as though continuing her careful observation of the room and its occupants. Mr. Jennings and Mr. Holt were present as well, both exhibiting the usual blend of civility and minor tension that accompanied Flaxborough's social observances. Purbright allowed a few moments of unremarkable activity to pass, giving the town, or rather these participants, the space to act naturally. Observing their interactions, he noted the subtle cues, the brief hesitations, the quiet glances, the almost imperceptible shifts in posture. Each was a signal, a confirmation, a thread leading toward a pattern that had been quietly building since the flower show incident. By mid-morning, he invited the three to sit in a small adjoining room, a modest space that offered privacy without ceremony. Tea was poured, and polite conversation commenced with neutral remarks about the day and the exhibits. Purbright listened more than he spoke, allowing each individual to express themselves, to reveal through gesture and tone the inclinations that civility often concealed. The young woman maintained her composure, but subtle signs betrayed awareness of scrutiny. A small lift of the brow, a delicate adjustment of the wrist, an almost imperceptible modulation of voice when responding. Purbright began to speak, slowly and deliberately, framing his observations as reflections rather than accusations. He mentioned the photograph and the smudge, the misfiled catalogue entry, and the displaced frames. He spoke of the anonymous note and the subtle adjustments in the children's sketches. Each item was presented calmly, factually, without embellishment, yet with emphasis on the sequence of minor incidents that had woven the week into a coherent pattern. The young woman's attention never wavered, though a faint tightening of her lips suggested the smallest ripple of unease. Mr. Jennings shifted slightly in his chair, attentive yet reserved, while Mr. Holt nodded with polite interest, unaware of the deeper implication threaded through Purbright's words. Finally, Purbright paused and allowed silence to settle, letting the implications of observation, careful orchestration, and subtle manipulation emerge naturally. The room, though modest, seemed to stretch in the quiet, as if the weight of accumulated observations demanded attention. Then, with the same calm precision he had displayed throughout the week, he spoke the essential truth. "Room 15, he began, and the series of minor disturbances and observations we have noted were not accidents. Each, whether the smudge, the misfiled entry, the displaced frames, or the subtle notes, was carefully placed, measured, and intended to elicit responses, to observe reactions, and to guide perception without overt interference." He allowed this to sink in, watching the reactions closely. He continued, pointing gently to the young woman. "It is clear, from the consistency of observation, the careful modulation of behaviour, and the subtle orchestration of minor incidents, that these actions have been conducted with intention. You have been testing boundaries, measuring civility, and revealing, through small gestures, the patterns of social propriety and pride in Flaxborough." A faint blush coloured her cheeks, and her hands rested lightly in her lap, betraying the smallest tension. She inclined her head in acknowledgment, and Purbright's expression remained calm, civil, yet imbued with quiet authority. "What has been demonstrated," he concluded, "is that influence need not be loud, and observation alone can shape perception, reveal character, and illuminate the otherwise unseen structures of human behaviour." Mr. Jennings exhaled softly, a mixture of relief and understanding passing across his features. Mr. Holt regarded the photograph and frames with renewed attention, as though seeing them freshly, and as though recognising the unspoken dimension of minor acts that had guided attention throughout the week. Outside the small room, Flaxborough continued its daily rhythms, unaware of the quiet resolution achieved within its walls. The minor anxieties, careful glances, and understated rivalries had been observed, understood, and gently resolved by the patience and attentiveness of one individual, Inspector Purbright. As the day drew to a close, the exhibits were restored, the minor disruptions noted and understood, and the participants departed, each carrying with them an appreciation of the delicate interplay between civility, observation, and influence. Purbright returned to his office, settled at his desk, and began his paperwork with the serene satisfaction of a man who had traced the hidden threads of behaviour, revealed the quiet orchestrator, and restored the equilibrium of a town that appeared unchanged but had, in truth, been subtly illuminated. Flaxborough resumed its polite routines, its cobbled streets echoing once more with ordinary steps, yet beneath the surface the lattice of understanding, observation, and subtle revelation now lay fully apparent to those who had watched with care. And in his office, Purbright, quiet and attentive as ever, reflected on the intricate choreography of human behaviour that had quietly unfolded over the week,